American commanders stared at their maps in disbelief when Australian SAS radioed their position 60 miles deep into enemy jungle after just 48 hours. "Good God, they're already there," one officer whispered, realizing these soldiers had moved faster through hostile territory than anyone thought humanly possible. How did a handful of Australians accomplish what entire American battalions couldn't? And what made the enemy fear them more than any other force in Vietnam? May 24th, 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The jungle waited like a living thing, thick and dark and endless. This was enemy ground, had been for years, and everyone knew it. The Vietnamese fighters who called themselves the Viet Cong owned these trees, these trails, every shadow and stream. They knew where to hide, when to strike, how to vanish. And now, into this green hell, Australian soldiers were about to disappear. Operation Hardihood was beginning. The name sat in folders at American headquarters, another mission in a war filled with missions. The 1st SAS Squadron was going in, small teams of Australians trained for jungle fighting. Their job was simple to say but hard to do. Move 60 miles into VC territory, watch the enemy, find their camps and trails, call in airstrikes and artillery, gather the kind of information that saves lives and wins battles. American command officers looked at their maps that morning and made their plans. They knew jungle movement. They had watched their own units struggle through the thick vegetation day after day. A good American platoon, 30 or 40 strong men with radios and machine guns and all the equipment modern war required, could cover maybe 8 to 12 kilometers in a day. Sometimes less. The jungle fought you for every step. Vines caught your boots. Thorns ripped your uniform. The heat sat on you like a wet blanket, 95 degrees with humidity that made the air feel thick enough to chew. So the Americans did their math. 60 miles was about 96 kilometers. If these Australians moved like everyone else moved through jungle, they would need 3, maybe 4 days just to reach their area of operations. The planners scheduled artillery support for day 3. They positioned helicopter quick reaction forces for day 4. They built their timelines around what made sense, what experience taught them, what the jungle allowed. But the Australian SAS operated on different rules. The jungle in Phuoc Tuy Province was triple canopy rainforest. That meant 3 layers of trees, each one blocking more sunlight than the last. On the ground, you walked in permanent twilight. Thin shafts of light occasionally broke through, golden and thick with moisture. The air tasted like rotting leaves and living plants all mixed together. Every breath felt heavy. The smell never left you. That combination of wet earth and decomposing vegetation and growing things fighting for space. Sounds filled the forest. Cicadas screamed their endless song. Birds called from branches you could not see. Somewhere, monkeys crashed through the canopy. And underneath it all, the quiet rustle of a million insects doing whatever insects do. The noise made it hard to hear danger. Hard to know if that sound was wind or enemy movement. Hard to stay alert when your brain wanted to shut out the endless assault of jungle noise. The Australians carried 80 pounds of gear each. Ammunition, rations for 7 days, water, medical supplies, radios, weapons. Everything a small team needed to survive alone in enemy territory. Their rifles were L1A1 SLRs, different from the American M16s, heavier, louder when fired. They carried grenades, smoke markers, spare batteries, some brought claymore mines. Every ounce mattered because they would carry it all, mile after mile, through terrain that wanted to stop them. These men came from a different tradition. The Australian SAS had learned jungle fighting in Malaya years before Vietnam. They had fought communist guerrillas in another rainforest, another war. They learned to move quietly, to track enemies, to survive on almost nothing for weeks. They learned patience. They learned that sometimes the best fight is the one you do not start. They learned to think like hunters, not like soldiers in a regular army. The VC controlled Phuoc Tuai province with 1,500 fighters, maybe more. The 294th Regiment operated here and the 275th. These were not farmers with old rifles. These were main force units, experienced and disciplined. They had fought the French years ago. They had outlasted the Americans already, would outlast them still. They knew every trail through their jungle. They knew which streams had water, which trees gave fruit, where the land rose and fell. They set ambushes that killed with terrible efficiency. They struck and vanished like smoke. They owned the night completely. American forces fought them with firepower and numbers. When a platoon found the enemy, they called in artillery. They called in jets with bombs and napalm. They brought helicopters filled with more soldiers. They had every advantage technology offered, but the jungle swallowed advantages. The enemy just disappeared, waited, struck again somewhere else. At 0600 hours on May 24th, the SAS teams loaded into helicopters. 4 men here, 6 men there, small groups that could move like ghosts. They flew low over the jungle, watching the endless green pass beneath. Then down, landing in clearings or openings, rotors beating the air, grass flattening, and the men were out, running, disappearing into the tree line. The helicopters lifted away, and the jungle swallowed the teams completely. Radio silence began. The teams vanished from the world. Back at headquarters, American officers marked their expected positions on acetate-covered maps. Day 1, they should reach here. Day 2, perhaps there. Day 3, finally in position to begin real reconnaissance work. The math made sense. The timeline fit everything they knew about jungle movement. But the Australians were not moving like everyone else. They moved in single file, spacing themselves carefully. The point man watched for danger ahead. The second man covered different angles. The third carried the radio. The fourth or fifth or sixth, depending on team size, watched behind. They communicated with hand signals. No talking, no unnecessary noise. They tested the ground before putting weight down, feeling for branches that might crack, leaves that might rustle too loudly. Every hour they covered almost 2 kilometers, not in straight lines, because the jungle never allowed straight movement, but they flowed around obstacles, reading the land, choosing paths that looked impossible but worked. They used game trails too narrow for larger forces. They moved during hours when the enemy rested. They became part of the jungle instead of fighting against it. The VC were out there, moving through their territory, confident and unworried. This was home ground. They set up camps, moved supplies, planned ambushes against the predictable Americans who announced themselves with noise and numbers. They did not know that small teams of Australians were sliding through the forest like water, leaving almost no trace, covering distances that should have been impossible. 48 hours passed. 2 days and 2 nights of continuous movement with minimal rest. The SAS teams pushed through exhaustion, through the weight of their gear, through the heat that never stopped. Their uniforms rotted from sweat and humidity. Their boots squished with moisture. Insects bit every exposed piece of skin, but they moved mile after mile, faster than anyone thought men could move through hostile jungle. And then, on May 26th at 0830 in the morning, A radio crackled to life at American headquarters. An Australian voice, calm and professional, broke radio silence. The team was in position. They were ready to begin operations. They sent their grid coordinates. The officer receiving the message looked at his map, found the position, and felt his stomach drop. He checked again, certain he had made a mistake. He called over another officer. They both stared at the map, at the marks showing where the SAS should be versus where they actually were. The distance was impossible. The speed was beyond belief. And yet, there it was, confirmed, verified, undeniable. The Australians had covered 60 miles through enemy-controlled jungle in just 48 hours. Someone in that command post spoke the words that would become legend. Good God, they're already there. The difference between how Americans fought and how the Australians fought was like the difference between thunder and a knife in the dark. Americans brought everything. Australians brought just enough. Americans moved with platoons of 30 to 40 men. Radios crackled constantly. Machine gunners carried M60s that weighed 23 pounds empty. Medics hauled aid bags. Radio operators bent under the weight of equipment that let them talk to jets and artillery and headquarters. Officers studied maps. Sergeants kept men in formation. The whole group moved together, a small army trying to slip through jungle that revealed every mistake. Australian SAS patrols were 4 men, sometimes 6, never more. Each man was a complete soldier, trained in weapons, communications, medicine, navigation. They did not need specialists because everyone was a specialist. They did not need large numbers because they did not plan to fight unless cornered. Their whole purpose was to see without being seen, to know without being known, to gather information that other units could use, to destroy the enemy with precision instead of guessing. The numbers told the story. American units carried enough for 3 days, then needed resupply by helicopter. The helicopters made noise, gave away positions, announced to every enemy within miles that Americans were operating in this area. SAS teams carried 7 days of food. They could stretch it to 10 or 12 if needed. They did not need helicopters. They needed nothing but what they brought and what the jungle provided. Movement speed revealed everything. Americans averaged half a kilometer per hour through thick jungle, sometimes less. The vegetation fought them. Their numbers made them slow. They had to move together, keep visual contact, maintain security for 40 men instead of 4. A platoon moving through jungle sounded like a platoon, boots and equipment and voices and radios. The noise traveled far. The VC heard them coming from a kilometer away, sometimes more, and simply disappeared or prepared ambushes. SAS teams moved at 1.5 kilometers per hour, 3 times faster. They used trails American units could not use because those trails only fit a few men walking single file. They moved during early morning when the VC rested. They moved during afternoon when heat made everyone drowsy. They read the jungle's rhythms and worked within them instead of against them. 4 men made almost no sound. 4 men could freeze, could hide, could let enemy patrols pass meters away without being detected. The training made all the difference. American soldiers learned to fight as units, to work together, to bring overwhelming firepower. Good training, necessary training, but built for conventional war. Australian SAS learned to unlearn. They had to forget the aggressive instincts that normal military training built into soldiers. Attacking was easy, waiting was hard, shooting felt right. watching enemies walk past your hiding position, letting them live because killing them would reveal your presence. That felt wrong. It felt like cowardice, even though it was the highest form of professional skill. They learned to read signs in the jungle that other soldiers could not see. A bent blade of grass meant someone passed recently, but how recently depended on how much the grass had straightened. Fresh bends meant minutes. Partially recovered meant hours. Fully straight again meant a day or more. Crushed leaves told stories. Dark green, crushing meant fresh, perhaps an hour old. Brown edges meant several hours. Completely brown meant half a day or more. The jungle was a book written in tiny details that most soldiers never learned to read. Silent movement became religion. They learned ghost walking, a technique of placing the heel down first, feeling the ground, testing for branches or leaves, then slowly rolling weight forward onto the ball of the foot. Every step took 4 times longer than normal walking. Every step was silent. Hours of movement left almost no trace. They learned to control their breathing, to slow their heart rates, to become part of the forest's background noise instead of standing out against it. Smell discipline mattered as much as sound. No cigarettes in the field, ever. The smell carried for hundreds of meters. No scented soap or deodorant. The jungle had its own smells, and human products announced presence like a flare. Some teams even stopped eating certain rations because the smell, when heated, gave away positions. They learned to smell the enemy before seeing them. That combination of fish, sauce, and cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies that VC carried with them. The philosophy behind it all was completely different from American doctrine. Americans believed in finding the enemy, fixing them in place, and destroying them with superior firepower. Search and destroy. Aggressive patrolling. High operational tempo. It worked in open terrain, in conventional battles. In the jungle against guerrillas, it mostly produced casualties and frustration. Australian counterinsurgency thinking came from British experience in Malaya. The enemy was not an army to destroy. The enemy was a fish swimming in an ocean of civilian population and jungle terrain. You could not drain the ocean, you could not kill every fish, but you could learn their patterns, where they swam, when they fed, where they rested. You could become a better predator than they were. You could make them afraid to move, afraid to operate, afraid to exist in their own territory. The first SAS contacts proved the concept. A 4-man team hidden beside a trail watched a VC squad of 12 men walk past. The Australians let them go. Hours later, the same team observed a VC meeting, counted attendees, noted weapons, memorized faces. They called in artillery that night on the exact meeting location. 18 enemies killed. 0 Australian casualties. Perfect intelligence creating perfect results. Another team tracked a VC supply column for 3 days, never revealing themselves. They mapped the entire route, identified cache locations, counted porters. When they called in the information, American jets destroyed 6 months of stored supplies. The VC never knew how the jets found their hidden caches. They never knew watchers had followed them for days, invisible and patient. The kill ratios climbed. 18 enemies dead for every Australian killed, then 20 to 1. The numbers seemed impossible, but they were real, verified, documented. Not because Australians were better shooters, though they were excellent, because they fought smarter. They only engaged when they had every advantage. They ambushed from positions the enemy never suspected. They struck and vanished before reinforcements arrived. Intelligence maps filled with details, enemy bunker locations, trail networks, supply routes, rest areas. The SAS saw everything because they operated where the VC felt safe. Deep in their own territory, the enemy relaxed. They talked freely, they moved carelessly, and hidden teams of Australians watched it all, recording, reporting, building a picture of enemy operations that transformed how the war was fought in Phuoc Tuy province. The VC began to notice. Prisoners reported fear of small patrols. Captured documents described ghost soldiers who appeared from nowhere, killed without warning, disappeared without trace. VC commanders issued new orders, increase security, change movement patterns. Assume you are being watched. The paranoia alone reduced enemy effectiveness. Fighters who constantly looked over their shoulders made mistakes. Units that changed patterns became predictable in new ways. But the hardest part for the Australians was not the danger. It was fighting their own instincts. Australian military tradition celebrated the Anzac spirit, aggressive frontal assault, courage in attack. Have a go. Fight hard. Never back down. That tradition won battles in 2 world wars. In the Vietnam jungle, it got soldiers killed for no gain. SAS men lay in ambush positions for 6, 8, 12 hours without moving. Muscles cramped. Insects crawled across faces. They could not brush them away because the movement might be seen. They watched enemy soldiers eat lunch meters away. They heard conversations. They saw opportunities for easy kills. And they did nothing because discipline mattered more than aggressive action. One team watched a VC battalion commander walk down a trail with only 2 bodyguards. The team leader could have killed all 3 easily. Instead, he followed them to their camp, observed for 2 days, called in an airstrike that destroyed the entire command element. 37 enemies killed, including senior officers. Far better result than 3 dead soldiers and a compromised patrol. The first time an SAS patrol ambushed a VC unit, the sound told you everything was different. The L1A1 rifles cracked louder than M16s, a heavier, sharper report. 7.62mm bullets hit harder. The enemy position erupted in chaos. Return fire came wildly, spraying the jungle where the Australians had been, not where they were. Within 90 seconds, the patrol was gone, withdrawn to a rally point 300 meters away, while the VC searched for an enemy that no longer existed. The smell of cordite mixed with jungle dampness. Spent brass lay scattered in the ambush position, but the Australians were gone. They heard the VC calling to each other, organizing a search. They heard wounded enemies crying for help. They heard anger and confusion, and they kept moving, putting distance and silence between themselves and their victims. After every contact, the lesson reinforced itself. Patience worked, discipline worked, intelligence gathering worked. Aggressive seeking of contact got men killed. The jungle rewarded the hunters and punished everyone else. But all of this tactical brilliance was building toward one moment that would define the operation. May 26th, 1966, 08:30 hours. The radio transmission came through clearly despite the distance. An Australian voice, professional and calm, reported position and requested fire support coordination zones. At the American command post, officers gathered around the radio. This should not be happening yet. The Australians were supposed to be 30 or 40 miles away, still moving toward their operational area. Support assets were positioned for day 3 or 4 arrival. The radio operator asked for confirmation. The Australian repeated his grid coordinates, patient and certain. An American major pulled out his map, found the grid, and stared. He checked again because the numbers made no sense. He called another officer over. They both looked at the map, at the acetate overlay showing planned movement routes, at the mark representing where this patrol actually was. 60 miles from their insertion point. 96 kilometers through enemy-controlled triple canopy jungle in 48 hours. The distance was impossible. The speed violated everything they knew about movement through hostile terrain. And yet, the coordinates were clear. The transmission was real, and the Australians were exactly where they said they were. The phrase that would become legend spread through headquarters within minutes. Officers gathered to look at the maps, to verify the math, to understand how a handful of soldiers accomplished what seemed beyond human capability. Other SAS teams checked in throughout the morning, all reporting similar positions, all ahead of any realistic schedule. The entire operational plan had to change. Artillery batteries received new coordinates, repositioning to cover areas where the Australians actually were instead of where planning said they should be. Helicopter quick reaction forces moved forward to different staging areas. Fire support coordinators scrambled to establish new zones. The timeline that took days to build had to be rebuilt in hours because one element refused to operate at conventional speed. At 08:35, confirmation came through. The position was verified. The Australians were in place and beginning reconnaissance operations. At 08:40, American staff officers recalculated distances and speeds, checking their math multiple times because the numbers seemed impossible. 200 meters per hour through thick jungle would be good. The Australians had sustained 1,200 meters per hour for 2 days straight. By 08:45, the command post buzzed with activity. Every plan based on normal movement rates was obsolete. The Australians had compressed a 4-day operation into 2 days and were already gathering intelligence while support elements were still getting into position. At 0900, new orders went out to every unit in the operational area. Timelines were adjusted, support was repositioned. The war had suddenly accelerated because soldiers who thought differently had changed what was possible. The SAS teams did not stop to celebrate. They did not rest despite covering 60 miles in 2 days. They had a mission. Immediately after confirming their position, they began the work they came to do. Observation posts were established on ridgelines overlooking known VC trails. Teams moved into positions that gave clear views of enemy base areas. The reconnaissance that American planners thought would begin on day 4 was already producing results on day 2. Within the first 6 hours after reaching their operational area, SAS patrols identified 15 enemy positions. They mapped 3 major trail networks. They observed 2 supply columns moving through the jungle, counting porters and noting cargo. They spotted 4 bunker complexes that intelligence had not known existed. Precision artillery strikes followed on 3 different targets, all direct hits because the observers were exactly where they reported being. The intelligence flowed back to headquarters faster than analysts could process it. Maps that had been mostly blank in this region suddenly filled with detailed markings. Enemy positions, movement patterns, supply routes, rest areas, water sources. Every observation added to the picture, building understanding of how the VC operated in territory they thought they controlled completely. When the first SAS team called for fire support, American artillery crews responded immediately. The grid coordinates came from deep in enemy territory, from positions the gunners had not expected to be supporting for another 2 days. But the coordinates were precise and the targets were verified. The guns spoke and shells screamed through the sky, landing exactly where the hidden observers directed them. The enemy never knew what hit them. One moment, a VC supply dump sat hidden under triple canopy, safe from observation, protected by distance from American bases. The next moment, high explosive shells crashed through the trees. Secondary explosions erupted as stored ammunition cooked off. Fires spread despite the jungle's dampness. The destruction was total, and the survivors had no idea how the Americans found their position. Another team directed an airstrike. F4. Phantom jets came in low and fast, guided by radio calls from soldiers the VC did not know were watching. Napalm tumbled through the air, bright orange flames spreading across a hidden enemy camp. The heat was so intense, it killed vegetation 100 meters away. The screams carried, but the SAS team was already moving to another position, professional and detached. Before and after statistics told the story clearly. American conventional units operating in the same area typically identified 2 or 3 enemy positions during week-long operations. They did this through aggressive patrolling that alerted the enemy and led to ambushes and casualties. The SAS teams identified 15 positions in 6 hours through patient observation from concealment, 0 friendly casualties, perfect intelligence gathering. Supply interdiction rates showed even more dramatic differences. American units, when they found enemy supplies, typically destroyed 10 to 15% because the VC had time to scatter and hide materials when they heard conventional forces approaching. SAS operations achieved 40 to 50% destruction rates because the enemy never knew they were observed until artillery or airstrikes arrived without warning. Combined arms warfare became surgical. When SAS teams marked targets, artillery knew the coordinates were accurate because observers were in position to see results. Air support missions became efficient because pilots trusted the soldiers on the ground, soldiers who had proven they were exactly where they said they were. Helicopter quick reaction forces could respond faster because the Australians had already confirmed enemy positions and cleared landing zones. Captured documents revealed the impact from the enemy perspective. One VC after-action report described an encounter with what they called phantom soldiers. The patrol had moved along a familiar trail, confident in their security, when they came under precise fire from an unexpected direction. Before they could react, the attackers vanished. A search found only spent rifle casings and boot prints that led nowhere. The VC commander reported that his men were afraid, that they no longer felt safe in their own territory. Another captured diary from a VC political officer described growing fear among the fighters. They called the Australian SAS teams ghosts with painted faces. The officer wrote that his men reported being watched, though they never saw watchers. They found evidence of recent observation posts overlooking their camps. They discovered trails they thought secret had been mapped and marked. The psychological impact was severe. Fighters who constantly felt observed, made mistakes, became paranoid, lost effectiveness. VC commanders issued new orders throughout Phuoc Toi province. Increase security on all movements, vary patterns and routes, assume enemy observation at all times, double sentries at rest areas. The orders themselves reduced enemy effectiveness because constant vigilance exhausted soldiers and slowed operations. But the orders could not solve the fundamental problem. The Australians were better at jungle warfare than the VC were in their own jungle. For the SAS soldiers, the experience combined professional satisfaction with genuine fear. They were 60 miles from their base, surrounded by enemy forces, operating in terrain the VC knew perfectly. Every sound could be danger. Every shadow might hide enemies. The nights were worst, listening to jungle noises, knowing VC patrols moved nearby, trusting in camouflage and stillness and luck. But training overcame fear. The teams were small enough that every man knew every other man completely. Your life depended on 5 other soldiers. Their lives depended on you. That trust created cohesion stronger than fear. When one man saw danger, every man reacted instantly. When someone made a mistake, others compensated immediately. The teamwork was perfect because anything less meant death. They operated for days at a time without speaking above a whisper. Hand signals conveyed complex information. A raised fist meant freeze. 2 fingers pointing meant enemy at that direction and distance. A wave meant move out. An open palm meant danger close. They communicated perfectly in silence. Their bodies adapted to the environment. Uniforms rotted from constant moisture. Boots fell apart and were repaired with tape and wire. Skin broke out in rashes. Leeches attached and had to be burned off. Food tasted like wet cardboard. Water purification tablets made everything chemical. Sleep came in short periods of exhaustion, and still they moved, watched, reported, struck, and vanished. The professional excellence showed in small details. After calling artillery on an enemy position, teams waited and watched instead of immediately relocating. They observed who came to investigate, how many, how organized. That information went into reports. They tracked secondary explosions, confirming ammunition was stored there. They noted escape routes the survivors used. Every detail added to the intelligence picture. When jets dropped bombs or napalm, the teams watched the results with cold professional interest. They counted enemy casualties visible through the destruction. They noted which bunkers survived, which collapsed. They called in corrections for future strikes. They felt no glory, no excitement, just professional soldiers doing difficult work in terrible conditions. The enemy adapted but could not solve the problem. VC units tried counter-tracking, sending teams back along their own trails to ambush followers. The SAS teams saw through it. They watched from positions the VC never checked, let the counter-trackers pass, then continued observing. Enemy forces tried deception, creating dummy trails and false camps. The Australians identified deceptions through patient observation, noting that false positions lacked the small details real camps always had. Some VC units tried to avoid the SAS by changing provinces entirely. Intelligence reports showed enemy movement out of Phuoc Tui into neighboring areas. The units that remained learned constant vigilance. They never relaxed, they never felt safe. And exhausted, paranoid fighters make poor soldiers. The Australians had proven something fundamental. A handful of highly trained soldiers using proper counterinsurgency tactics could dominate guerrilla forces even in the guerrillas' own territory. Numbers mattered less than skill. Firepower mattered less than intelligence. Aggressive patrolling mattered less than patient observation. Everything conventional military wisdom taught about jungle warfare was wrong. The SAS showed the right way, and it all started with being where the enemy thought you could not be, doing what they thought you could not do. 60 miles in 48 hours, impossible but real. The tactical methods the Australian SAS perfected in Phuoc Tui province spread through other units, though not as completely or as quickly as they should have. Other Australian infantry battalions adopted some techniques. Patrol sizes decreased. Operations lasted longer between resupply. Noise discipline improved. Soldiers learned to read jungle sign better. The results showed in casualty rates. Australian forces in Vietnam maintained some of the best kill ratios of any Allied units, often 20 enemies killed for every Australian what lost. American units showed mixed results. Special forces and long-range reconnaissance patrols embraced similar tactics enthusiastically. They saw the value immediately: small teams, extended operations, intelligence gathering over body count. These units achieved results comparable to the SAS, proving the methods worked regardless of nationality. But conventional American infantry largely resisted the changes. The tactics felt wrong to units trained for aggressive action. Command wanted body counts, measurable results, not patient observation. Doctrine emphasized firepower and maneuver, not stealth and intelligence gathering. The resistance came from culture as much as tactics. American military tradition celebrated decisive action. Aggressive commanders got promoted. Units that generated high body counts received recognition. Patient intelligence work did not fit the metrics that headquarters valued. So most conventional units continued operating as they always had, with predictable results. High casualty rates, frustrated soldiers, an enemy that could not be pinned down or decisively defeated. The tragic irony was complete and bitter. In Phuoc Toi province, Australian forces achieved near-perfect tactical success. They dominated the VC, they controlled territory, they interdicted supplies, they gathered intelligence. They inflicted casualties at ratios that proved absolute tactical superiority. The kill ratio of 20-1 meant the Australians were not just winning, they were dominating completely. Every measure of tactical effectiveness showed Australian methods worked, and none of it mattered strategically. Vietnam was not a war that could be won tactically. The enemy had time, patience, and political will that outlasted any amount of military success. American and Australian tactical victories meant nothing when the enemy could absorb losses indefinitely and continue fighting. Superior small unit tactics could not overcome unclear political objectives. Brilliant soldiers could not fix strategic incoherence. The Australians proved you could win every battle and still lose the war. The long-term impact on enemy operations was real but limited. Throughout Phuoc Toi province, VC forces changed how they operated. They moved differently, rested differently, planned differently. They avoided areas where SAS teams operated. They increased security measures that slowed their operations. They developed counter-tactics, though none proved fully effective. Post-war Vietnamese military analysis acknowledged Australian tactical skill. Professional soldiers recognized professional excellence even across enemy lines. But the VC also recognized that tactical defeats did not equal strategic failure. They could afford to lose battles. They could afford casualties. They could afford to operate less efficiently in certain provinces. Time was on their side. Political will was on their side. They would outlast the foreigners regardless of kill ratios or tactical innovations. The human cost of this strategic reality was terrible. SAS soldiers who survived Vietnam carried complex feelings about their service. They knew they had performed brilliantly. They knew they had proven better at jungle warfare than guerrillas in their own jungle. They had statistics and enemy documents and their own experiences to validate their excellence. And they also knew it accomplished nothing lasting. They fought perfectly in a war that could not be won by fighting. Some soldiers did not survive to wrestle with these questions. Despite the favorable casualty ratios, SAS teams took losses. The jungle killed men through disease and accident even when the enemy did not. Some patrols walked into ambushes despite all their skill. Some soldiers died from wounds that could not be treated 60 miles from medical care. The names went on memorials, and the survivors remembered friends who proved human excellence could not overcome bad luck or overwhelming odds. Post-war life for surviving SAS veterans was often difficult. They returned to Australia where Vietnam service was controversial. They had proven themselves among the finest soldiers in the world, and many civilians did not want to hear about it. The skills that made them excellent in jungle combat did not translate to civilian employment. Patience, observation, silent movement, the ability to endure terrible conditions, none of this helped find normal jobs. Many struggled with the transition. The statistical validation of their methods came through analysis done years later. The numbers were clear and undeniable. 20-to-1 kill ratios compared to much worse ratios for conventional forces. Casualty reduction of 60 to 70% in units that adopted SAS tactics compared to those that did not. Intelligence value that analysts rated 300% higher per soldier per day in field. Supply interdiction rates 45% versus 15% for conventional operations. Every measurable metric proved the same thing. The methods worked perfectly. The bitter lesson was that proving the methods worked did not mean they would be learned or adopted. After Vietnam, American military largely rejected counterinsurgency lessons. The experience was too painful, too associated with failure. Conventional doctrine reasserted itself. Big units, heavy firepower, maneuver warfare. The institution forgot what the SAS and Special Forces had proven in the jungle. It took decades for the lessons to return. In the 1980s and 90s, Special Operations Forces began rebuilding institutional knowledge. They studied Australian SAS operations in Vietnam. They interviewed veterans. They analyzed the tactics and statistics. They incorporated the lessons into training. When American forces went to Afghanistan and Iraq, the new generation of special operations soldiers carried knowledge paid for in Vietnamese jungle 20 years earlier. Delta Force operators learned about patient observation and intelligence gathering. Navy SEAL teams studied small unit tactics and extended operations without support. Army Rangers incorporated lessons about noise discipline and camouflage. The 60-mile, 48-hour infiltration became a teaching point about what properly trained soldiers could accomplish. The story of American command saying, "Good God, they're already there," became legend that carried important truths about unconventional warfare. Modern special operations doctrine owes significant debt to Australian SAS Vietnam experience. The emphasis on small teams, on intelligence over body count, on being where the enemy thinks you cannot be, all trace back to lessons learned in Phuoc Tuy province. The tactics finally stuck because a new generation of military leaders recognized that some wars cannot be won with conventional methods. Sometimes you need soldiers who think like hunters, who value patience over aggression, who understand that the best fight is often the one you do not start. The strategic reality about winning battles while losing wars remains painfully relevant. American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan achieved tactical excellence repeatedly. They dominated every engagement. They adapted tactics brilliantly. They generated favorable casualty ratios. And like in Vietnam, tactical success could not overcome strategic problems. Superior soldiers, operating with brilliant tactics, could not fix unclear political objectives or create victory through military means alone. The jungle in Phuoc Toi province has reclaimed the battlefields. The trails where SAS teams move silently are overgrown or turned into roads. The sites where they called in artillery or airstrikes are now fields and rubber plantations. Farmers work land where soldiers once fought. Children play in areas where men died. The bunkers have collapsed. The fighting positions have eroded away. Even the trees that bore bullet scars have grown over the damage or fallen and rotted. But in training facilities around the world, instructors still teach the story. Young soldiers learning unconventional warfare hear about the Australians who moved 60 miles in 48 hours. They learn about small teams dominating large enemy forces through patience and skill. They study the tactics, the mindset, the professional excellence. The story survives because it teaches truths that remain relevant. The story teaches that in unconventional warfare, excellence is not about firepower or numbers. It is about being better than your enemy at their own game. It is about adapting to the environment instead of trying to dominate it. It is about thinking differently, operating differently, accepting that effective tactics often feel wrong to conventional military thinking. The story also teaches the hardest lesson. You can do everything right tactically and still operate within strategic failure. You can prove beyond any doubt that your methods work, that your tactics are superior, that your soldiers are the finest in the world, and none of it guarantees victory. Wars are won or lost at political and strategic levels that individual soldiers cannot control. The Australians in Phuoc Toi province proved you could achieve tactical perfection in jungle counterinsurgency. They proved small, highly trained teams could dominate guerrilla forces even in the guerrillas' home terrain. They proved that patience, discipline, and intelligence gathering create better results than aggressive patrolling and body counts. They proved all of this beyond any reasonable doubt. They also proved something more painful. Tactical excellence without strategic coherence is ultimately futile. Brilliant soldiers fighting perfectly in an unwinnable war achieve nothing except proving their own excellence. The tragedy is not that they failed. They succeeded completely at everything within their control. The tragedy is that their success meant nothing in the larger context of strategic failure. Today, the lessons live on in special operations communities worldwide. The tactics are taught. The statistics are studied. The story is told. Young soldiers learn that when properly trained and properly employed, small teams can accomplish things that seem impossible. They learn that being where your enemy thinks you cannot be, doing what they think you cannot do, creates advantages that numbers and firepower cannot match. But the wisest instructors also teach the harder lesson. Excellence in tactics is not enough. You can be the finest soldiers in the world. You can dominate every engagement. You can prove your superiority beyond doubt, and you can still serve in a losing effort. Military excellence must serve coherent strategy, or it is wasted, no matter how brilliant. The jungle remembers nothing. Plants grow, animals move through, rain falls and sun shines. The land cares nothing for the human dramas that played out beneath the trees. But soldiers remember, the regiment remembers. And in that memory, carried forward through training and teaching and tradition, the 60-mile, 48-hour infiltration lives on. Not as celebration, because there is little to celebrate in tactical brilliance serving strategic failure, but as lesson, as warning, as example of what human excellence can achieve and what it cannot change. The story endures because warriors in every generation need to understand both parts of that truth.